Scary True Home Alone. Stories that will terrify you. Story 6. The Man in the Woods. A stranger's unsettling request. Natalie had always enjoyed the quiet, secluded life she led in the countryside. There was a kind of peace in the vast expanse of land that stretched out in every direction from her family's home. The road that led up to her house was unpaved, surrounded by thick woods on both sides, and her nearest neighbors were miles away. She relished the solitude, and often spent her days walking through the fields or sitting by the lake, losing herself in the stillness. It was the kind of place where she could breathe deeply and forget the pressures of the world. It was on one of those quiet afternoons that everything changed. The sun hung high in the sky, its warmth a welcome embrace, as Natalie lay on her lounge chair in the yard, soaking in the last of the late summer sun. Her dog, Buster, a golden retriever, lay beside her, content and dozing peacefully. The sound of distant birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees filled the air. Everything seemed perfect. But then, from the edge of the woods, she noticed something. Someone, to be exact. A man. He appeared suddenly, walking out from between the trees at the far edge of her yard. He was tall, wearing a faded denim jacket and jeans, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He seemed to be moving toward her with a sense of purpose, yet there was something unsettling about the way he walked. His gait slow and deliberate. The way he emerged from the woods, seemingly out of nowhere, sent a ripple of unease through Natalie's chest. At first, she thought he might be lost, or maybe a hunter who had wandered off the trail. But there was something about the man's presence that didn't sit right with her. He didn't seem like someone who belonged out here, where the only company she had was the occasional deer or the sound of the wind in the trees. Buster, sensing her unease, stood up, his tail stiff and ears perked. He growled low, a warning that sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. "Hey there!" Natalie called out, trying to sound casual despite the sudden knot in her stomach. "Can I help you?" The man stopped in his tracks, just outside her yard, and looked at her. His face remained in shadow, but his eyes, dark and cold, seemed to pierce through the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a soft but deliberate voice, the man spoke. "Excuse me, miss. I've had a bit of trouble with my water pump. I live up the hill, just beyond the trees. Could you help me out?" His words were polite, but there was an edge to them, a quiet urgency that made her uneasy. "It's broken, and I'm afraid I'm not able to fix it myself." Natalie's heart began to race. There was something in his tone, something that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the request, it was the way he phrased it, the way he seemed to expect her to say yes, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. She had never seen this man before, and there was no reason for him to be out here. The isolation of the land meant that anyone she encountered was someone she would remember. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I don't think I can help you. I have a lot to do, and I'm really not familiar with those things. Maybe you should call a professional." The man didn't move, his eyes still locked onto hers. There was no flicker of disappointment in his gaze, just a cold, unsettling stillness. Then, without saying another word, he turned and began to walk back into the woods, slowly, as if waiting for her to change her mind. Natalie watched him go, a knot in her stomach tightening. Something was off. She had lived in this house her entire life, and she knew every inch of the woods around it. She had never heard of anyone living up the hill, as he had mentioned. In fact, she knew there was no property up there, not for miles. The man had to be lying. She quickly gathered her things and went inside, locking the door behind her. Buster stayed by the window, his eyes never leaving the woods. He whimpered softly, still uneasy. Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man's request had seemed so innocuous, yet it had sent a chill through her, After a few minutes, she tried to shake it off. She told herself that she was just being paranoid, that he was probably just a wanderer who had lost his way. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. She had to know more. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drove her to take action. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her father's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. He wouldn't be home for hours. Without thinking, she grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the edge of the property where the woods began. As she stepped outside, the air grew cooler and the sunlight began to fade. The woods stretched out in front of her, dark and foreboding. She could hear the crunch of leaves beneath her boots as she walked, her breath quickening with each step. There, in the distance, where the woods grew thicker, she thought she saw something move. A shadow, perhaps, or maybe just the wind, but it was enough to make her pause. Buster had been right. She wasn't alone out here. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but the need for answers drove her forward. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, whether it was the man from earlier or something more sinister, but she had to know. Her eyes scanned the darkening woods, searching for any sign of movement. And then, just as she reached the base of the hill, she saw him again. The man. He was standing there, partially hidden behind the trees, his figure barely visible in the gathering darkness. But this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't alone. There were two others with him, figures who stepped out from the shadows, as silent and still as the trees. Natalie's blood ran cold. Her breath caught in her throat, and her legs trembled. She turned to run, but before she could move, she heard a voice from behind her. "Don't run," the man's voice called out, eerily calm. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Natalie stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was no escape. There was nowhere to hide. She wasn't alone in the woods, and they knew she was there. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the truth behind the stranger's unsettling request is revealed. Who are these men, and what do they want from Natalie? What will happen when she confronts the terrifying truth? Make sure you don't miss the next part of this chilling story.